So it's week 8, part 1. We're starting with passport authentication. So we've copied our lesson 6 folder to lesson 8. I'm just going to open this up with WebStorm. We'll get our application up and running. And then we'll start working on getting Passport configured and installed. And I'm not sure whether in my, okay, I'll just connect to my local instance of MongoDB. And I'll open up a command prompt. I'm going to open 2 command prompts. If you're connecting to an MLabDB, you don't need to run MongoDB locally. I'm going to run mine locally now. I'll start up my MongoDB server. If you are using local MongoDB, then you need to get your server running too. I'll run MongoDB. So my database server is running. I'll just leave that active. And I'll open a second command prompt so I can just launch my application. I'll use NodeMon to get it running. It says lesson 6. I'm going to change that in a minute. And here were our drinks that we added to the database. I guess it's been 4 weeks now. Back in week 5, we started populating our database. So we could view, we can add, we can edit and delete. I'm just going to change this. It says lesson 6 in my title variable. I'm going to change my route on index.js so it says lesson 8, and instead it says, you know, local passport, local authentication. So I'll open up my root file and index.js. I'll just change that to lesson 8. That we're using Passport local this week, and this is kind of part 1 of 2 parts. So now it just says lesson 8. So just make sure you have a copy of the application running. Again, you can connect it locally or you can connect it to your MLab database. Whatever you like. MLab is a little easier if you've already have that connection, because then you don't have to bother starting a second command window and launching a MongoDB server if you use the MLab server.
You know why I'm getting, I haven't changed anything, I just copied the file over, and it says that I'm getting an error. It says variable mongoose equals required mongoose, the same unexpected token, pointing at the variable.
Unexpected token. That's probably a syntax problem somewhere. If Mongoose wasn't there, now you can check your node modules folder and make sure Mongoose is here. But it probably is, otherwise you'd be getting a message saying it cannot find module Mongoose.
Yeah, my Mongoose is there.
So if Mongoose is there, there's got to be a syntax problem somewhere.
Okay.
Have a look, Josh, in your, maybe in your model, in your drink model.
Okay.
So we use the word Mongoose 3 times here, right? We require it. We use new Mongoose schema. And we're exporting a mongoose.model here.
Okay. That might be it.
So the first thing we need to do now that once I've got my application running, is we need to actually install Passport. And you saw in the video, it's not just one package. There are actually 5 packages we need to install. So I'm just going to stop my Node server for a minute. I'll clear out my command window. And if you go to the lesson 8 folder on Blackboard, here are the packages you need. It's these 5. So there's the main Passport package. There's Passport Local, which is the strategy we're using today, local storage of user credentials. Passport Local Mongoose basically does exactly what you would expect. It allows Mongoose to work with a local store of user accounts. Express Session is used for managing sessions because we're going to use sessions, the session object, for storing information about users. And Connect Flash is used for putting messages into the session object. So we can set a message on one page, but display that message on the next page. So you can either run 5 npm install commands, or you just list each one of these packages. We can actually install multiple packages with one command. I'm going to do that to save time. So if we run npm install Passport, we can actually add all the package names into this one command. We just separate them with a space. That's why packages can't have spaces inside the names. If I run this command with a space between Passport and Passport Local, it actually will install both packages. I'm going to add all 5 of them at once. None of them are very big, actually, and there are only a few dependencies here, so it's not going to install 50 other packages along with it. Maybe 3 or 4 others will come along with this. That's about it. I'll add the ---- save option so package.json can track our dependencies and versions. So just a regular npm install with those 5 package names separated with spaces. And our ---- save at the end. So I'm going to run my command to get our packages installed. So a few dependencies, not too many really. And then I can minimize my command window. We're not going to be able to run our application for a little while. We've got to do some work configuring Passport. It's installed, but it's not being used or implemented in any way right now. So here are all the things we're going to do inside our Node application. Step one is done, which was download and install the npm packages. We now need to configure Passport, Most of that configuration is going to be done in app.js. We're going to require most of the libraries we installed. And as the developer did in the video, we need to set Passport up and do some configuration of it. We then will need to build a model. He built a model called account. We'll build a model with the same name. And that model will use Mongoose to talk to our MongoDB, so it can register log users in. We then need to build a register and login page. To save us time today, these are just HTML only views. So rather than us hand code them, I've just put all the HTML on Blackboard, and in a bit, we'll copy and paste those and save those as register.ejs and login.ejs. Then we're going to modify the header on our site. We're going to want 3 new links. We're going to want a register link, we're going to want a login link, and a logout link. Then we're going to have to add our code that uses Passport to create a new user when they submit the registration page, and then code on our login form when the user posts that form to check the login. Now that code's actually very small because Passport does most of the work for us. So we don't actually have to write a lot of code once Passport's configured. And the final thing we're going to do, and I think we did this with our PHP application last semester, is we're going to want to modify the navigation bar. So when a user is anonymous, our links in our header will say home, register, and log in. As soon as they've registered and logged in, we'll hide the register link and login link, and we'll show the drinks link and the logout link, and we'll maybe also show their username in the header here, as we're used to seeing in a lot of applications like, say, Blackboard, right? As soon as we log in, tells us who we are up here. So we'll add that feature as well. By the end of class, we should be able to do all this today, I think is reasonable, without going at a crazy pace. So once things are installed, let's open up app.js. And so we've added most of what's in app.js. We added this reference to the drinks controller and mapped URLs starting with drinks there. And we also added our connection section, our database connection. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add all of our Passport configuration just below this section here. The first thing we're going to do is make some references to the packages we installed. Use Passport. We'll create a variable called session, which links to the Express session package. We installed Connect Flash. Now, there were 2 other packages we installed. There was Passport Local. We're going to reference that one, but we're going to reference that one in a slightly different way. There was also Passport Local Mongoose. We don't need that one here. We need that one in the model we're going to create. So of the 5 we installed, we're going to reference 4 of them in our app.js. This one's going to be a little different from what we've seen so far. We are still going to require passport-local. However, we're going to instantiate an instance of this class. We're going to call it local strategy. And rather than having it be equal to the entire package, we want to instantiate an object of type strategy. So strategy is a class inside the package. And what the word strategy means is what type of authentication are we using? So in this case, we're saying a local strategy as opposed to, say, a Facebook strategy or GitHub strategy. Okay, so that just means the authentication method. So there are the references we need. So much like when we've referenced other files, so for example, things the generator gave us, like logging and managing cookies and parsing form, you know, we required the libraries here, and then the Express generator enables them. It calls app.use to actually enable these modules. We're going to need to do the same thing with these packages. We're going to need a bunch of app.use commands. We've linked them in, and now we need to tell our application to actually use them. So we've linked to them, and now we're going to initialize we'll initialize the Flash object for storing messages in the session object and displaying those messages. We're going to use the session object. But when we initialize this one, we also want to set up a few properties. Customize how sessions will be used. So for example, one student asked in the Wednesday class, well, what if we want a really long session timeout? Like how long are the sessions? There's actually no default timeout. But if we want to specify a session, an inactive user should be logged out after a certain amount of time, we can set, for example, the max age, and that's in milliseconds. So a session will automatically expire after that number if we want to configure it. So there's a few things we want to configure for sure. One of them is a secret key. Now in the video, the developer used the secret right in here. Okay, he specified it in app.js. We already have a separate file for configuration variables, so we're going to put it in there rather than hard coding it in app.js. You could put it in app.js, probably better practice to put those variables in a separate file so that they're easily all stored in one place and we can change those. So we're going to put it, right now we have a config.db. We're going to add a variable to our config global variables called secret. We don't have this value yet. We'll put it in a minute. We're going to set the resave option to true. What this means is refresh the session every time the user loads a page. So as long as they're actively clicking through the site, moving from page to page or refreshing pages, we want their session to stay active. We don't want to time them out and make them log in again. The third value, we don't have to have, but it's a good idea, is save on in. I don't know if I spelled that right. Uninitialized. Oh, maybe I did. So what this means is don't initialize the session until someone signs up or logs in. If someone's just browsing our site anonymously, there's no need to create a new session at that point. Because every time we create a session, it uses server overhead. If it's just an anonymous user and we don't need the session object to store anything, don't create the session. So the secret value, Shally?
What's the function of secret? To make it a secret?
Okay, good question. Let's think back to our PHP class for a minute when we had passwords, right? Remember when we created a registration page, what did we do with our passwords before we stored a new user in the database? If somebody put in the username test and the password test, yeah, we would hash the password, right? So it would take that 4 characters of test and it would convert it to 128 characters, which works. The problem is if we all went to the same PHP website where we did that and we all used the same password, we all typed in TEST, when we hashed it, yeah, you couldn't read the hash, but it would all get hashed in the same way, right? So if someone looked in our user database, we'd see that you could see we all had the exact same password. What Passport does, not only will it hash the passwords, it will also perform a different kind of function first called salting. Has anybody heard of salting before in programming? Could explain what salting is? John, you have any idea?
Isn't it when it's like hashing? It's sort of encrypting the phrase.
Okay, so yeah, you're on the right track. So what salting, so we're going to use the secret for doing salting. What salting does is it lets us generate first a random string or set of random numbers and then use that in some algorithm to generate a hash. So rather than us generating the same hash for the word test, we first salt it so it uses some random characters first, and then that value is applied as part of the hash. Okay, so we need to set up some kind of string or key that random salt function will use. And in fact, you'll see when we use tie into GitHub next week, one of the things, if for example, you've ever tied in a Facebook application or Twitter application, something else, it generates a client ID and the secret's used for doing salting. It's like a random thing. Okay. So Passport uses it as well. So let's go to our config and our global variables. And after our database variable, let's add in a variable called secret. So this could be just some random string used to salt. Put in anything you like here. Don't copy mine exactly. It should be your own secret string. So using this value Passport, when we save a new user, it will automatically generate a unique salt value, which automatically generates a unique hash value for every password. So we don't have to put this in the config file. We could just put this value right in our app.js. It's best practice, just like our database connection, to store it in a separate configuration file. And make sure you add a comma here after your database. We didn't have that before, but we need it now because there are 2 variables in this array. So we've enabled initialized flash. We've initialized the session. Now we need to initialize Passport. We'll need about I think about 5 or 6 lines of code to set Passport up. Then we'll take a break. We're going to call the initialize function in Passport. As well as the Passport.session object. Now, right now, we only have one model, which is drink.js. After we come back from our break, we'll build an account model. So we haven't built it yet, but we'll build it next. So let's set up a link, a reference to that model. And our account model will inherit a method called create strategy. And lastly, we need two other functions that serialize and deserialize our user, because we use MongoDB to store information about that user's session state. So we'll call serialize user and deserialize user. We'll do the opposite. We can actually take a quick look at the Passport documentation for a little more information on exactly what these two functions do. He mentioned in the video how MongoDB tracks the user's session state. So nothing will happen. If I try and run the application right now, I'm going to get an error on line 39 where it's trying to require an account model and that file doesn't yet exist. So I won't bother running my application at this point. We'll just go to the Passport.js homepage for a second. So here's what the serialize, those last two commands do. If we look in the documentation. So normally, we only know a user's credentials at the time they log in. Once they log in, it creates a session and sets a cookie. So if they then go to different pages, we don't have their credentials anymore except on the login page. But their cookie identifies what their session is. So Passport serializes and deserializes, that basically lets us read and write who that user is to and from the session. So as they move around, we're not losing track. And so that's what our serialize and deserialize methods are doing here. So we needed, what do we have, about 15 lines of code in our app.js to get Passport ready to use. Does anybody have any questions so far? Josh?
Sorry, what did you say the app.use Flash does?
So connect flash, again, no place like npm to go and look. Connect flash is used for creating and storing messages. So the idea is if we want to display a message to the user, we might generate the message on one page, but we may want to display it on another page, right? But the web is stateless, so we have no easy way to pass a value from one page to another. So Flash is a session, uses the session object to store a message, so we can create that message over here and display it on another page. Okay, so we're enabling it. So we commonly use it, as it explains here, Josh, with redirect. We want to show them the message. By storing it in Flash, we can generate it here and display it somewhere else. Make sense?
Can you give us the serialized and deserialized?
Okay. So when a user logs in, we have their username and password, right? So we know who they are. But once they leave that page, we don't know who they are anymore, right? We need to before we leave, we need to store their identity in the session object. So when we go to the next page, right, that page wants to check, do we know who this user is or are they anonymous? So serialize and deserialize, that allows us to read and write information about the user from the session. Remember in our PHP example, actually, we can look at the code for a minute. Let's just pull up. It's similar to something we did in PHP, if this helps. Here we want to check the session for a user ID if it's empty. But before we do, right, what is that line doing? Right. If we don't call session start, we can't read any variables that are in it, right? It will always be empty. So the serialize and deserialize, it's doing something similar. Okay, it's allowing our code to access the session and any variables that are in the session. So it's kind of similar to calling session start, sort of the passport of equivalent in a way. Not exactly the same, but you could think about it as performing a similar function. Does that help? Okay. Any other questions about our configuration so far? Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break here? I'll pause the video stream. We'll come back at 10 after 9. So our next steps are going to be build the account model, and then we're going to grab the register and login views from Blackboard and create those and add links to them so we can load those pages. That'll be the next things. Then we'll start adding the code to actually get the register and login working.